HRN listeners. As we celebrate our 15th year, we are deepening our commitment to giving voice to the next generation of food systems storytellers, and we need your help. Our internship and fellowship programs help activate new possibilities for underrepresented and underestimated young people through experiential journalism, audio engineering, and production training. Through these unique programs, HRN helps food equity stewards build essential workforce readiness skills that expand their potential and foster economic mobility. Please consider supporting these critical programs. And with a minimum donation, you can be entered to win a dinner for two at an amazing restaurant in one of 8 cities and tickets to a concert at a great venue in one of those cities. We have incredible partners across the country who have donated, as they also share our passion for helping to educate the next generation of food systems storytellers. Check out heritageradionetwork.org/15 to donate and enter to win today. That's heritageradionetwork.org/15 to donate and enter to win today. And make sure you donate before March 31st. Thank you.
This episode is brought to you by Appeal. Appeal is a plant-based protective layer that helps produce last up to twice as long. Learn more at appeal.com.
This week on Meat and Three, we're looking at things that have changed and things that are still in flux. From mothers balancing new lifestyles to the social stigma surrounding pumpkin spice.
You got rid of the star rating system and talked about, I'm not going to use the word ethnic when I talk about food.
They recognized that safety was our motivation, and they were very receptive to the changes, understanding what we were trying to accomplish.
A cupcake or a piece of bacon or a glass of rosé is not inherently gendered.
Tune in to Meat and Three, HRN's weekly food news roundup, wherever you listen to podcasts.
Hello, this is Lisa Held, and you're listening to The Farm Report, a Heritage Radio Network show about the people, processes, and policies that shape how food is produced today. Producing food requires land. As a result, forests are often razed to make space for crops or animals, creating environmental trade-offs. But what if there were a middle ground between forest and farmland? My guest today is Jacob Grace, a program manager at the Savannah Institute based in Madison, Wisconsin. And we're going to be talking about a farming system called Agroforestry. Jacob, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Lisa. Glad to be here.
So I want to just kind of make this episode essentially an Agroforestry 101 to really give people a sense of what this looks like. Before we dive into that, why don't you give listeners a quick overview of what the Savannah Institute is?
Sure. So the Savannah Institute is a nonprofit organization. We're based out of Madison, Wisconsin, but we're working throughout the upper Midwest, and our goal is really to lay the groundwork for agroforestry throughout the upper Midwest. We're a pretty young organization. We've really only been active for about 5 years now, but we're working with a lot of partners and have a lot of new projects coming up. So we're eager to try to expand and support agroforestry as much as we can here in the Midwest.
Got it. And what's your background?
I grew up on a farm actually in northern Missouri, and my parents are still on the farm and raise beef cattle, do some grazing, and then also raise prairie plants, which is kind of unusual.
Wow.
And we also had a fair bit of timber on the farm growing up. My parents still do. So I was involved in doing some forestry work as well. And after growing up in northern Missouri, I ended up at the University of Wisconsin studying agroecology, which is just kind of a cross between conservation biology and agriculture, or agriculture and ecology, as the name suggests. And And it was while I was doing graduate work here at UW-Madison that I first learned about the Savannah Institute and was really interested in what they were doing, and ended up getting to work for them now. So that's how I got where I am.
Got it. Well, and it's cool that there's kind of a direct line between the work you're doing now and the farm you grew up on. That's
definitely.
Yeah. So, okay, so I'm going to just throw this out, the most basic question ever. What is agroforestry?
Yeah, that's a great place to start. And I try to keep it simple. I know there are a lot of definitions floating around out there, but I think agroforestry is anytime you're using trees for agriculture or using trees for farming, basically. And so that can incorporate a lot of different things. And the USDA recognizes 5 main agroforestry practices. But if you go to other parts of the world, especially, but even in Europe, they kind of laugh at the idea that there are only 5 agroforestry practices. There can really be a lot of different potential things people could be doing. And when you get into the tropics, that's a whole other world in terms of agroforestry. So to just try to kind of keep it simple, I often define agroforestry as just anytime we're using trees or even shrubs, tree-like plants for some type of agriculture or farming.
Okay. And I didn't realize that other parts of the world were using agroforestry so much. Is the U.S. sort of behind on that front?
Well, I think to look at it historically, agroforestry is one of the oldest types of agriculture of all. And, it's been done for thousands of years, really, and around the world. And a lot of indigenous farming practices incorporate some type of agroforestry. So, kind of taking the long view or the historical view, there's a lot of different stuff out there. And again, using my pretty broad definition, agroforestry has been going on for a long, long time and in a lot of different parts of the world. And that's part of why it can be difficult to define, is that in different parts of the world, it can look pretty different, especially thinking about in the tropics compared to someplace like where I'm at in Wisconsin, where we have 4 very specific seasons and we have a very hard winter. And so it really changes what's possible here.
Right. I think it's like a lot of things in agriculture. There are practices that have been used for a very long time, by many farmers, and then they some fall out of use, or maybe they're used on an ongoing basis. But then there's a word for it, and it's like, oh, what's this new thing, right?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Yeah.
Yeah. So you mentioned the 5 practices that the USDA recognizes, and I know the Savannah Institute works on kind of educating people on those 5 practices. So I thought one way to do this is just kind of go through each of those and talk a little bit about each one.
Yeah.
So let's start with riparian buffers. How do you describe a riparian buffer?
Yeah. So a riparian area is kind of the boundary of land right near a body of water. So if we're thinking about things like erosion or pollution, riparian areas are really important because it's kind of the last place to stop some of these things from going into a body of water and potentially contaminating it. So there are a lot of different things that people do in these riparian areas to try to reduce soil loss or potentially prevent some of the runoff or things like that. But in terms of agroforestry, one of the things you can do is plant trees. And that means that there will be roots in the ground there all year round, helping stabilize that soil. And that can kind of anchor some additional habitat or ecosystem functions that can hopefully filter some of that water as it's running off the land, getting down to that body of water. So to just keep it simple, it's planting trees near the edge of bodies of water, like streams or rivers or lakes or something like that.
Right. These are really widespread where I am in Maryland because of the Chesapeake Bay, and I'm sure you know the biggest source of pollution into the Chesapeake Bay is agricultural runoff. Our watershed includes farms in New York, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia. And one of the biggest things that has been effective at keeping those nutrients out of the bay is planting riparian buffers along streams and just all the waterways that lead into the bay. So that's one that we talk a lot about in the Mid-Atlantic for sure.
Got it.
So how about silvopasture? What does that look like?
Yeah, so silvopasture is, by the USDA definition at least, it's the agroforestry practice that brings livestock in mainly. So silvopasture is a combination of three things, and it's important to have all three. You got the livestock, you have trees or shrubs, and then you have some type of forage that you're growing beneath those trees. Especially where I am in Wisconsin, there's a pretty negative history of people doing unmanaged grazing in the woods, which is not the same thing as silvopasture. That's just letting your livestock run around in the forest, and it is usually detrimental to the trees and the habitat. But when it's done well, silvopasture is the incorporation of livestock and tree crops, or some type of tree, and then forage or something for the livestock to graze, and managing that in a way that all three kind of mutually benefit and support each other.
Right. So that one really applies to livestock, to farmers that are raising animals. And then on the other hand, we have alley cropping, which is more for cropland.
That's right. It's exactly. So alley cropping is planting trees within existing crop ground, basically, and then having rows of trees that gradually mature, and depending on how you're doing it, you'll probably keep raising crops for a while until those trees get larger and form a canopy, and then you can either shift over to silvopasture or do some type of forest farming underneath. But alley cropping is really just a way of raising rows of trees within or alongside of crops.
Are there certain crops that are best suited to that kind of system?
That's a good question, and I think the answer is complicated because you can also be planting a lot of different trees in these rows, and this is something we're working on at the Savannah Institute, is thinking about, depending on what type of trees or shrubs you're planting, what kind of crops go well with that. And one of the things that ends up happening is that as these trees mature, you can start out growing some more traditional annual crops that are going to need a lot of sunlight. But then as those trees start to mature, you can start shifting over to maybe some things like winter annuals, or something that's going to have a little bit different growth period, maybe not need as much sunlight. So but I think there are a variety of crops that will work, but also thinking about the progression of crops that you're going to plant as those trees mature is pretty important.
Got it. Okay, and what about windbreaks?
Yeah, so this is another one that's pretty straightforward. This is just planting trees along some type of boundary to interrupt wind flow. This is another one that I think is fairly common around here, even when I drive across Iowa, and it's pretty much all corn and soybeans as far as the eye can see. Near most of the houses, you'll see a little windbreak that people have planted to shelter their houses a little bit. And this is something that farmers will use these windbreaks to help prevent wind erosion or reduce wind erosion. And then also now more and more people are planting these windbreaks to help to try to prevent pesticide drift or any type of pesticide or herbicide traveling from field to field. They can plant some type of quick growing tree like a poplar they're not really raising the tree to harvest anything from it necessarily, but just to really provide a buffer and have some big leaves and some things to try to interrupt that flow.
That's interesting. And the trees aren't affected necessarily by
the idea
drift?
is the trees would be negatively affected, but hopefully it would, reduce any more serious impacts to the field.
It would still stop it from... Yeah. Okay. Okay, and the last one is funny because it sounds kind of just like the word agroforestry, forest farming.
Yeah.
So what is forest farming specifically?
Yeah, so forest farming is thinking about using forests to produce agricultural products, basically. It's often easiest to explain with examples. So things like sugar maples, raising, maple syrup is an example of forest farming. People that are using forests or, different setups with forest logs or things like that to raise mushrooms is another common example of forest farming. So it's something that we're, at least in the Midwest, we're not used to thinking of farming happening in a forest, but there are certain things that you can raise that you do want to have in a forest or even under shade. So things that you don't want to have out in an open field. And again, it's something that, we're used to raising crops and fields that need lots of sunlight, but there are some of these other things that you can raise much better in a forest in a shaded system.
Right. Are there risks to that approach in terms of disrupting the forest itself?
Yeah, so that's a very important consideration, and it depends on whether if you have a really nice pristine forest, then hopefully you're managing that for habitat or for ecosystem services rather than just for agricultural production. But in thinking about kind of the timeline of some of these agroforestry practices, if you're doing something like alley cropping, you're starting out with these small trees that are getting larger and larger, and then at some point you may end up with this field that is a mostly closed canopy of trees, and then you might want to think about what are some things you can raise under that canopy where it's not really a really pristine forest that's really good habitat quality, but it is still a closed canopy and shaded, and you might want to think about how to use that, and forest farming would be a good option.
Okay. So, agroforestry is not well known, I would say, at this point. I mean, like you said, I think probably some people are using some of the practices and might not even realize that there's a name for it. But overall, it doesn't have a lot of widespread, there isn't widespread sort of awareness. How do you have any sense of how many farmers at this point are using agroforestry, or if one or a few of these practices are much more common than others? Yeah,
so I think you make a really good point that I think more people are doing it than realize it, especially when it comes to things like windbreaks and riparian buffers. And because a lot of these agroforestry practices have kind of fuzzy definitions like we've been talking about, or because people don't necessarily realize that they're using agroforestry, it is hard to know how widespread it is. The USDA has started trying to estimate how many farms are using agroforestry, and in the last couple of agricultural censuses, they've had a question about whether or not farms are using some type of agroforestry. So in the 2012 ag census, it's listed as about 2,000 farms said they were using agroforestry. And then in the 2017 ag census, it said about 30,000. But apparently the definition that they were using changed in between those two surveys. So they can't really be compared to each other. But and that also doesn't take into account, that's just talking about number of farms. That's not asking number of acres, which in some ways is the more interesting question. But I think it's safe to say there are a lot of farms that are using some type of agroforestry, but how many are actually really aware of that and doing it on a large number of acres, I think is pretty small.
Yeah, that's interesting, though, that they're collecting stats at the USDA. I didn't realize that. I've spent a lot of time looking at that ag census data. So next time I'll go in and check out the agroforestry stats.
And don't be fooled, because it does sound like they changed how they were calculating it between the last two. So it seems like a pretty amazing increase, but that's not necessarily the case.
I'm sure that's a bummer on your end. You're like, wow, everyone's doing agroforestry. It's incredible.
Yeah.
All right, we're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back. This episode is brought to you by Appeal. Here at HRN, we care about reducing waste across our food system, from farms to home kitchens. We know that about half of the produce we grow ends up in the trash. We want to enjoy produce at peak freshness and reduce the amount that gets thrown away. That's where Appeal comes in. Appeal is a plant-based protective layer that helps produce last up to twice as long. It's edible, invisible, and imitates how peels naturally protect fruits and vegetables. Because here's the thing, less waste doesn't just mean we're throwing less food away. It also means we waste less water, energy, and other resources that go into growing produce. Appeal works with nature to reduce waste across the food system, from the farm to the kitchen. Appeal helps us conserve our precious resources to ensure we have fresh food to meet our growing need. Appeal. Food gone good. Learn more at appeal.com. All right, we're back. You're listening to the Farm Report on Heritage Radio Network. I'm Lisa Held, and I'm talking to Jacob Grace from the Savannah Institute about agroforestry. So, Jacob, we've been talking about what agroforestry looks like, what it is, what the practices are. What are the most significant benefits? Like, what is the point of all of this, essentially?
There are a lot of benefits.
Let's start with the environment.
I'll try
let's start with the
to
environment.
focus on a couple big ones, and the environment's a great one to start with. And in particular, at the Savannah Institute, one thing we're really focused on is carbon sequestration and climate change mitigation. And so agroforestry, being a perennial type of farming, means that there are roots in the ground all year round. It's building up that woody biomass, so that's taking carbon out of the atmosphere, and as much as possible getting it down into the soil where hopefully it's a little bit more stable. And then also, in putting that carbon down into the soil, building soil organic matter, hopefully retaining some of that soil, preventing soil erosion. So from an environmental perspective, there are a lot of benefits of trying to incorporate agroforestry, and I think it's important to include that those are environmental benefits on working agricultural lands. So trying to keep these lands in agricultural production, keep them making a profit for the farmer, while also doing this climate change mitigation and carbon sequestration. And just looking at let me pull it back up here. Project Drawdown lists silvopasture as number 9 on its list of climate solutions. So that's number 9. It's right in between solar farms and rooftop solar panels. So I think that kind of puts into context where just the impact that some of these agroforestry practices can have if they're adopted on a pretty broad scale and if they're done correctly. So environmentally speaking, agroforestry has a lot to offer.
Right. And then what about benefits for farmers? Like, are there ways that it can make a farm more financially viable, more resilient? What does it look like for the
So this
farmer?
is another thing that we're really interested in. at the Savannah Institute, and we're thinking about the environmental side of things, but especially here in the Midwest, also thinking about the fact that for these to be widely adopted, they do need to be profitable for farmers and for landowners. And one of the main benefits we see of agroforestry right now is allowing farmers to diversify their sources of income. A lot of farms and a lot of farmers are really struggling right now if they're dealing with the commodity market. Here in Wisconsin, the dairy industry is really in trouble. And that's a really unfortunate situation, but it's also can be an opportunity to, present farmers with something that could potentially be an additional source of income with some of these agroforestry types. They wouldn't necessarily need to quit anything they're doing already, but they can incorporate a new crop or some type of new practice that might hopefully diversify their sources of income as we're facing a lot of variability in some really tough times. So in addition to that, providing diversity of income sources, another bonus of agroforestry that we talk a lot about is something that's called over yielding, which sounds like it might be a bad thing, but it is actually, it's a tricky term, but it's the idea of basically getting 2 or more crops off the same piece of ground. So, farmers are always interested in getting the highest yields they can, but that's usually off of just one crop. If you bring in agroforestry practices, you can start getting multiple yields off the same piece of land, which is a way to kind of raise that ceiling or to over yield, basically. So if you're thinking about something like alley cropping, you could be raising pretty close to the normal amount of some crop that you'd been raising on that field, but then also growing these trees that are ultimately going to be producing something as well. So you can start having yields over 100% basically off of a piece of land. So that's something that we talk a lot about to try to kind of put it in the terms, the economic terms that some landowners might already be thinking about.
Right. And when you say that trees would be another source of income, they would be producing, fruit or nuts.
And that's a good thing
instance.
that we haven't really talked a lot about yet to kind of think about the practices again is, raising the trees themselves to produce some type of crop is usually either a fruit tree or a nut tree, a nut crop of some kind. And then also some of these shrubs that, don't look like trees. We wouldn't think of them as trees, but they are technically an agroforestry crop. So a lot of different berry bushes, for example, get kind of lumped in with agroforestry and have a lot of the same benefits.
Right. Well, and I mean, something like a fruit tree, if you're planting a small tree and then you're waiting for the day when you're able to harvest fruit from it, that's going to be several years, right? It's going to take a while for it to, So I would imagine there's this long period of time where farmers are setting up these systems and are not necessarily seeing, another crop that they can sell. Is that waiting period? Is that a barrier to
that's
adoption?
Exactly right. That's one of the biggest barriers to some of these agroforestry practices is the length of time it takes to establish some of these tree crops. And that's why some of these practices like alley cropping on the cropping side and silvopasture on the livestock side are great because they make it possible for farmers to keep using that land, to keep that land in production, to keep it cash flowing while these trees are young and getting established. So that's really a major benefit of those two practices, and why we at the Savannah Institute are doing a lot of work and a lot of research on those practices, because when it comes to expanding agroforestry, that's going to be one of the first hurdles that a lot of people have to overcome is what are we going to do with this land as we're waiting for these trees to grow? And so that's where things like alley cropping and silvopasture really have a lot to offer.
Right. I mean, theoretically, you could be already farming that land. You would already have it, and you're just adding to it, right? So you don't need to actually acquire more land, right? But then of course, there's a cost to to actually purchasing the trees, installing the system. How big of a cost is that upfront cost for farmers?
That's another big upfront cost, like you're saying, is not just purchasing the trees, but also maintaining the trees. And that's, I think, an important thing to note is a number of the partners that we work with talk about how it's not just important to plant trees. Our goal is not just to plant trees, but to grow trees. Planting trees is kind of this one-time thing that you get them in the ground, then you walk away. But that doesn't necessarily have any benefits if that tree doesn't survive. What we are really trying to do is to grow trees, so get them planted, and then the years of care that follow that to make sure that tree becomes an effective crop and starts sequestering carbon and getting all those benefits is really a long-term thing. And most of the cost is right up front when you're not getting any return off of that tree yet. So there are some pretty big upfront costs. And then another major obstacle that kind of goes along with that is land access. And perennial farming systems like agroforestry kind of force farmers and institutions really to kind of think more long-term than they're used to thinking necessarily. So if you're going to do agroforestry on a piece of land, you kind of need to know that you are going to be able to have access or have control over that land for at least 10 years, probably at minimum. And a lot of our land leasing policies and just kind of our, a lot of the structures of how we access land in the Midwest are not really set up for that. And that's not necessarily a financial obstacle, but it's related of, to really establish some of this
I would imagine,
agroforestry.
because a lot of young
you need
farmers,
to have an agreement that allows you to have control over that land
systems,
for
but
decades,
a lot of them
really,
are renting
it's not
land in the
be worth the
beginning and don't
investment.
have the capital
and that's kind of a
to
tricky
purchase.
problem, but we're doing some work
like
on
you
that
said,
too.
you can't be planting trees that that are going to be growing for decades if you've got a 2-year lease. It's just crazy. So there are some barriers, but there are these exciting benefits potentially for the environment and also for farmers. What are some things that are happening at the Savannah Institute or that others are doing that you think will really have an impact on expanding agroforestry and overcoming some of these barriers?
That's a good question, and it's a tough one to think about. I think one of the first things that we're trying to do at the Savannah Institute, especially as kind of a young organization, is just kind of gathering the elders. So here in the Midwest, there are some farms that have been doing agroforestry for decades already. They're few and far between, but there are people out there who have been doing this and kind of making a lot of the mistakes for us that we can learn from. And that's been a big part of what we've been doing is trying to connect with some of these farmers and visit their farms. We've done a couple different video series where we go and just show what these farms look like, show people what it can look like to see a mature agroforestry planting, which can be really inspiring. We got some really amazing drone footage this summer at one of these farms of a drone flying around over this farm that had trees planted in contour, and it was just really beautiful. So I think that's one of the first things we're doing is kind of trying to connect with the elders, for lack of a better term. And then also in terms of organizations, there are a lot of organizations that have been working on finding more sustainable ways to farm for decades now and getting connected with them and figuring out how to plug in. We're facing a lot of environmental crises right now, but I guess the flip side of that is there are a lot of organizations and a lot of funders out there who want to do things about that and want to make change. And so there's getting to be a little bit more momentum for some of these things like agroforestry, well-managed grazing, some of these things that can keep our farmland productive while still producing some of these environmental benefits.
Right. Do you think that agroforestry has potential at a really large scale? Like the examples I've seen are mostly small farms, which might be, which isn't a bad thing necessarily if all small farms do it that way, right? But I'm just curious, like, are there examples or do you see it being applied on like much larger farms as well?
I would say it absolutely is possible to be done at the large scale. And I think it's important to be aware of the trade-offs with that. You know, a lot of the really cool agroforestry stuff is done at the small scale because those are the, you know, super diverse, very well managed systems that, you know, people don't really have the time and money to do at the large scale. But it's kind of the trade-offs of quantity versus quality, I guess. And this is something that I deal with on almost a weekly basis, is kind of, you know, living with that tension. And I think to deal with some of these things like the climate crisis, we're going to need really large scale solutions. And I think agroforestry can absolutely be that type of solution. With the understanding that it might not necessarily be this super high diversity system. It might be, you know, fields of trees planted in rows, and they might all be the same species, or it might be a couple different species. So it's, you know, it's going to look a little bit more industrial. But if we want to do it at a really large scale, we're going to need things that can be done at the large scale and managed at the large scale. So, you know, I think we need things at all levels along that continuum. We need the small farms that are doing tons of cool stuff on, you know, 5 or 10 acres. But, you know, some of the projects we're doing are working in Illinois, where it's, you know, corn and soybeans as far as the eye can see, and thinking about how can we use alley cropping, or I guess it would mostly be alley cropping, but, you know, start to figure out systems that could really be scaled up and be done on all across the landscape.
Right. Well, Jacob, thank you so much for all of your insights.
Yeah, Lisa, thank you so much. I'm always happy to talk about agroforestry.
And thank you all so much for listening to the Farm Report on Heritage Radio Network. If you enjoyed the conversation, please subscribe to the podcast, rate it, and share it. Until next time, this is Lisa Held. The Farm Report is powered by Simplecast. Thanks for listening to Heritage Radio Network, food radio supported by you. For our freshest content, subscribe to our newsletter. Just enter your email at the bottom of our website, heritageradionetwork.org. Connect with us on Instagram and Twitter at heritage_radio. You can also find us at facebook.com/Heritage Radio Network. Heritage Radio Network is a nonprofit organization driving conversations to make the world a better, fairer, more delicious place. And we couldn't do it without support from listeners like you. Want to be a part of the food world's most innovative community? Subscribe to the shows you like, tell your friends, and please join the HRN family by becoming a member. Just click on the heart at the top right of our homepage. Thanks for listening.